The image of surf, sand, sun, and hotties that are tied to the Beach Boys are what have made them an icon within pop culture. Now, their music has the power to transport you from literally anywhere into a 1964 Mustang cruising down a beach with a hottie on your arm and surfboards tied to the back of the car. Now that's some superpowers right there. And although their escapism is probably one of the best within music history, we still can't not acknowledge the tragedy that was behind the waves, behind the scenes of the actual Beach Boys. So strap in, it's gonna be a wild ride. We're gonna catch a wave through all the tea on the Beach Boys. These are the original 3 members of the Beach Boys, and they were all sons of Murray Wilson. There's Brian Wilson, the oldest, Dennis Wilson, the middle child, and Carl Wilson, the youngest. And Murray Wilson, their dad, was a jazz musician. He even had come out with a minor hit in his day. Now, Brian was definitely the protege, and he was Murray's favorite. Brian loved listening to bands, and they were mainly jazz bands like vocal harmonic, and he would learn all of their songs, listen to them over and over, and he would even practice them with his brothers at times. Now, Dennis Wilson was the rebellious child. He was always getting into trouble. He was constantly looking for a new thrill. And Murray, their dad, was very strict and very abusive. One time, Murray, the boy's father, when Dennis got in trouble, he had a glass eye. So he removed his glass eye, made Dennis stare into his eye socket, and then when Dennis flinched, Murray just punched him. Now, when Brian was 18, he wanted to put away doing the covers and start writing his own music. And he had quite the knack for rock and roll. However, Brian was incredibly introverted, never got out, didn't really have any friends besides his brothers. So Dennis suggested, hey, why don't you write a song about surfing? Now, Dennis was an avid surfer. He loved to surf, he loved the sun, he loved ladies, loved to drink. He was just a party child. He sounds like a great time. I literally love him.
Anyway,
So Brian took Dennis's idea and wrote a song about surfing. Do you see where this is going? So just so you know, Carl or Brian, none of them surfed. They lived in Hawthorne in Los Angeles. They never really left the suburbs. I mean, Dennis was the only one that was actually in this culture. And because of Dennis's suggestion, Brian wrote this great song. He invited his cousin over, Mike Love, and also his childhood best friend, Al Jardine, to play guitar. Mike Love was the vocalist. And the boys practiced this song called Surfin' for their dad, Murray. Now, Murray, with just his impeccable, genius ear for music, heard this song and said, oh my God, we gotta get this recorded. So Murray took a huge family trip all the way to the recording studio and got Surfin' recorded. And just like that, they had a record. Surfin' was actually recorded, get this, 1 take. It was recorded in 1 take. They literally did it live. They showed up, they played their song, and that's the track that is still synonymous with the Beach Boys. In SoCal, to get a song on the radio, it had to be called in by audience request. So the boys at that time gathered around a telephone, and each one did probably 15 different voices, and they called the radios, and requested Surfin', their own song. And before long, they were hearing Surfin' on the radio. The boys, but especially Murray, were ecstatic as Murray had finally found his cash cow and his new pathway to the fame that he never really achieved. After Surfin', we now had an official Beach Boys lineup. We had Brian Wilson, who wrote all the songs, sang, and played the bass guitar. We had Carl Wilson, who was on lead guitar, Al Jardine, who was on bass guitar, Mike Love, who was on vocals, and Dennis Wilson, who was the drummer. Now, Dennis was the only boy out of the group that really embodied the free-spirited SoCal surfer dude that would soon become the band's MO. Just remember that. This whole video also might be just me hyping up Dennis Wilson the whole time, but I promise it won't be a waste of your time. He's amazing. So the boys came up with a few more songs that were to be on their Surfin' Safari record, and Murray took the boys over to Capitol Records in LA, and just like that, they got signed, and they were redubbed the Beach Boys, which is way better than the Pendletones, which is what they were going to call themselves. That's just stupid. Anyway, So the boys released their first record, Surfin' Safari, and it did pretty good. The song Surfin' Safari in itself got top of the local charts and beat out Surfin' for the boys' best song at that point. They needed an algorithm to just start pumping out hits because they obviously had the potential. So Brian Wilson was listening to some Chuck Berry one day, heard this kind of groovy tune, and thought, hey, I can just totally rip off this beat and just make a hit out of it. So Brian consulted with Dennis, and Dennis gave him a lot of popular surfing locations around America. So Dennis gave Brian some surfing locations, and Brian arranged them into the famous, incredible bop, Surfin' USA. Now, Surfin' USA was to reach third on the national charts. This was by far their first big hit and really established them as the original OG surfer boy band. Now, this is just some foreshadowing. To this day, Mike Love claims that he wrote the lyrics to Surfin' USA. Releasing 2 records, Surfin' Safari and Surfin' USA, the Beach Boys had turned surfing into a literal national phenomenon, which I think
is freaking ironic because every single one of them was a kid except for Dennis, who literally was the best but doesn't get credit for writing Surfing USA anyway because Mike Love is the worst.
I mean, it changed surf culture. Boards after the Beach Boys were literally being made with plexiglass instead of wood because it was easier to carry and everyone could go surfing. Even wake machines at that point in the 60s were being created because of the Beach Boys, because people in the Midwest wanted to hop on that wave. Other surfing groups even began to pop up, and one of these surfing groups was a girl group. And they were called the Honeys, and one member was named Marilyn. And one night, the Beach Boys were performing a show, and Brian Wilson was singing the incredible love song Surfer Girl. And this was one of his first times he was singing in his falsetto voice, which would become what he'd be famous for. He can sing like a girl, and he's good at it. Brian is looking out into the audience, and he sees Marilyn, and she sees him. Anyway, she was 15 at that point, he was 20. They got married. I know, the 60s, right?
Round, get around, I get around, yeah, I get around.
It is 1963, and the Beatles have come to America. The British invasion was in full force, and all anyone could talk about were British boy bands and bowl cuts. I mean, the Beatles songs literally dominated the top 5 spots on the charts, and every American musician peed their pants. They were terrified. And the Beach Boys were no exception. Murray began also to put a lot more pressure on the boys. He wanted them to come out with more music, better music, and before long, they had come out with 4 albums in a year. And they did the whole Cars thing, and some more surfing things, and some California Girls things, and it was great. Brian, however, felt that he had not achieved his masterpiece yet, and also he felt that his father was kind of hindering his ability to produce music that he needed to, because Murray was literally destroying recording sessions. They actually unplugged his keyboard, so during sessions he could just have things to fiddle with to appease him, because he was literally being so disruptive. Dennis and Murray actually got in a pretty good knockout drag-out fight, and Brian finally fired his father, the 6th Beach Boy, from the band. So after Brian had fired his father, he suffered a huge anxiety attack, which actually took him out of touring. He said he didn't want to tour anymore. He just wanted to stay behind and practice music. So the band hired a new guy, Bruce Johnston, to take Brian's place. And Bruce actually went with the band to London, where they were to perform their songs. Now in London, the band was mostly met with positivity, but while on stage, they were laughed at because their appearance was too square and preppy. This really hurt Dennis Wilson because, as we all know,
Dennis Wilson is cool.
He was hurt that they weren't hip anymore, because that was their thing. They were the hip Beach Boys. They came home, and not only was Brian inspired by the Beatles and what sounds he could have that would be better than theirs, but also the rest of the band was like, okay, we have to have a change here. Brian Wilson hired producer Phil Spector, who worked on some of the largest hits at the time, to work on Pet Sounds with him. He also brought in a guy by the name of Asher to do lyrics with him. He was very disillusioned by the surf and the sun idol that they had created, and he was ready to write songs about love and emotions and
Drugs.
So Brian is creating this new sound, and it's really good. And Pet Sounds is released, and it's really well received by critics. It's actually, to this day, one of the best rock albums ever created. But Capitol Records did a really poor job of marketing the album, so it did not do well commercially. Brian is a typically pretty sad person, but especially in Pet Sounds, he was just in a terrible funk. And this might be part of why he participated in so many drugs in its production. Brian began experimenting with drugs with Asher. He was doing acid, methamphetamines, and marijuana, and you can kind of tell in the album. There's one song called Hang On to Your Ego it's just about hanging on to your ego while participating in drugs. He proposed this song to the band, and Mike Love hated it. Actually, Mike Love hated the whole Pet Sounds album. But Mike Love was like, this is not the brand we've created. This is not what I want to put my name and face on. And so they actually changed the words from Hang On to Your Ego to I Know There Is an Answer. Mike Love is just the worst. So after Pet Sounds, Brian releases Good Vibrations, his new hip song, using the theremin, kind of that UFO soundy thing. And it becomes a #1 and their greatest hit to date. Brian was ready to produce his final masterpiece. Because of Pet Sounds' poor performance commercially, Brian Wilson knew that he could do better. His masterpiece was not out yet, so in 1967, Brian Wilson began production on Smile. Now, Smile got really weird because Brian got really weird. He began to really heavily experiment with drugs, and he had a really bad trip on acid where he saw himself literally getting sucked into the void and like disappearing. And after this, he would hear auditory hallucinations, like saying these demons were going to kill his family and kill his wife. Brian Wilson was not doing too well, and this really came through in the production of Smile. Mike Love, of course, just hated the entire thing, but this one's a little bit more justified. Brian was just using wacky noises. In one track, he was even using fire truck sounds, and a house down the street while they were in production burned down. So Brian thought, oh my God, I'm a wizard. No, like he literally thought he was doing musical witchcraft. Yeah. We love Brian. So he actually burned those Smile tapes and burned a few others, and after that had a complete nervous breakdown that would leave him bedridden for 3 years, and he shelved the project Smile. At this point, the Beach Boys were in a decline, as it seemed that they'd already hit their prime and that they were just to be a short-lived fad of the early 60s. The Good Vibrations had really died out for the Beach Boys. Their concerts were at the lowest they'd ever been attended, and they actually had to start performing at nursing homes. Yeah. Capitol Records eventually dropped the band just because they weren't what they used to be, and a lot of this can be credited to Brian's absence. Their private lives were just as terrible as their music career was. So Mike Love had got involved in a scandal involving a woman he had an affair with who got pregnant with his child. Now, Mike was like, that's not my kid. It's not mine. And the woman said, yes, it is. And he said, bet. And they went to court. Long story short, the paternity test did confirm Sean Love as Mike's daughter. However, to this day, he is still in denial that she's his kid. She even looks like him. Men are such simple creatures. Mike had a daughter, and he illegitimatized her because he's the worst. Dennis Wilson, on the other hand, started hanging around a deadly crowd. What I mean by deadly is Charles Manson. He was introduced to Charlie Manson from two girls that were part of Charles Manson's family, and Dennis and Charles instantly had a connection. Charles even helped Dennis write music for the Beach Boys, but Dennis would sometimes have to change lyrics because, you know, they were written by a psychopath. And Charles did not like that because he was screwing up his message. So Charles threatened Dennis with a pistol and said, if you change my music again, I'll shoot you and I'll kidnap your family. And now's when Dennis was like, this is not good. I should probably skedaddle. So they kind of stopped being friends, and Charles Manson murdering Sharon Tate and then getting locked up kind of helped that. So, well, Brian, bless his heart, was completely confined to his bed, being tormented by visual and auditory hallucinations. He thought they were demons downstairs and didn't bathe and didn't even dress himself. He was pretty much in his bathrobe for the entire 3 years. Slowly he ballooned up to the weight of 300 pounds and was kind of eating himself to death, following in the footsteps of the late Elvis Presley. His wife Marilyn was really concerned about it, and she called famous psychiatrist Eugene Landy. Now, Landy had a very unconventional way of handling patients. It was 24-hour care, so he lived in with them, and he would monitor them and have like militaristic style schedules for them to follow. And in Brian's case, Landy even locked up the fridge with chain and padlock to keep Brian from eating. This extreme therapy was actually really good for Brian, though, because he was very extremely gone. So Brian eventually got to the point where Landy cleared him to go perform with the Beach Boys, and so Brian went and performed with them. Brian got to once again see his favorite brother drummer, Dennis. Now, Dennis was the new favorite. People were loving him. He was charismatic and fun and a ladies' man. He actually goes and marries, I love this, he marries Sean Love. He marries Sean Love, Mike Love's illegitimate daughter, practically his
second cousin.
Dennis marries Sean Love. She's 18, he's 39, and they punch out a couple of kids. This causes a lot of turmoil in the band because Dennis is like,
Dude, she's your daughter, just acknowledge her.
Mike is like, no.
She's not my kid. I'm not a hoe. I don't do that stuff. She's not mine.
And delusional. So the tension is escalating, and Mike Love had kind of gained control over the band by pitting himself, Al, Bruce against Brian and Dennis. Carl, the youngest Wilson brother, was kind of in the middle of it all. He was the peacemaker, but there wasn't much peace being made. So eventually, since it was 3 against 1 and Brian was toast, Dennis got kicked off the Beach Boys. The original Beach Boy, the only Beach Boy, got kicked off. I'll never understand, but it just gets worse from there. Dennis had problems with alcoholism in the past, and after losing his true love, music, he took to the bottle again. It was said that he would get a gallon of orange juice every day, dump out half of it, and pour the rest up with rum, and that's what he would eat/drink for the day. He was also not living with Sean anymore. He was now living on a boat and was practically homeless. Well, one day he was hanging out with some friends at Marina Del Rey, and he got toasted and decided to go for a swim. He wanted to get something at the bottom of the ocean, so he jumped in, and they think while underwater he must have hit his head on the bottom of a boat or a dock, and incidentally he got hypothermia and drowned. Terrible. So Dennis Wilson was pronounced dead in 1983 and was the first Beach Boy to go. Things were not looking very hopeful for them. Dennis Wilson's death seemed to be in vain because the Beach Boys just produced some terrible music after that. They came out with a god-awful country album and even a rap song to the classic Wipeout with this band called the Fat Boys. Yeah, cool. The song Kokomo was released in 1988 and is the Beach Boys' last #1 hit and their 4th #1 hit, and probably debatably their biggest hit. Brian Wilson unfortunately was not able to join the band in recording Kokomo as his psychiatrist, who was still living with him, Dr. Landy, forbade him from doing it. Landy had pretty much just got himself into every aspect of Brian's life. Landy was even living in the mansion while Brian lived in the guest house. Landy also had 80% of Brian's signing powder and was credited to writing music with him, so pretty much anything Brian was making, Landy was making it too. This breached the ethics of his medical license, and this was eventually investigated. His medical license was taken away, and a restraining order against Landy was eventually filed, thank God. So after Kokomo, the renaissance the Beach Boys were experiencing ended abruptly when, in 1998, Carl Wilson tragically died from cancer. Now, Carl was the glue between the band. He was the bridge that gapped Mike and Al and Dennis and Brian. And since Dennis was gone and now Carl was gone, Brian really had no reason to associate with himself with Mike and Al, whom he practically hated now. So Mike and Bruce won the rights to the Beach Boys, even though they obviously should have gone to Brian because, you know, he kind of created it or whatever. So Mike and Bruce got the rights, and Brian left. He didn't care. Brian's Brian. And Al got the boot too. Poor baby Al. That's what you get for being a bystander, Al. Duh. And so Bruce and Mike actually still toured with the Beach Boys name for a while, just completely merchandising it and turning into just crap. And Al also tried touring as well under the name of Beach Boys Family and Friends, which Mike sued him for it. He sued his own ex-bandmate. This guy is such... Sorry. Mike sued Al. Very unfortunate. Brian, one night, was hearing a band do cover of Beach Boys songs, and it actually inspired him to go out and tour again. So he asked this group if they would like to join his band, and they agreed. And so Brian went and finally toured the never-before-seen Smile. Now, this was just a huge moment for him, as this was his masterpiece that he was finally getting to show to the world 40 years later. Brian's performances got raving critics' reviews, and even the Smile record, which is now called the Smile Sessions, was released in 2011. Brian really wanted nothing to do with Mike and Al, which understandable because Mike is just ridiculous. But they did meet up in 2012 for their 50th anniversary tour without Carl and Dennis. This was the last time the Beach Boys played together and probably will ever play together. The Beach Boys is still considered one of the greatest rock bands to date, and actually is considered the greatest American rock band of all time. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, where they rightfully should be.
Yes, may I help you?
Is there a Brian Wilson here?
Yeah, he's upstairs in his room. Why?
We got a citation for him, ma'am. Excuse me. Brian Wilson?
Yes, I am.
Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. We're from the Highway Patrol, Surf Squad.
Hello.
Brian, we have a citation here for you, sir, under Section 936A of the California Catch a Wave Statute. Brian, you're in violation of paragraph 12. Failing to surf, neglecting to use a state beach for surfing purposes, and otherwise avoiding surfboards, surfing, and surf.
Surfing? I don't want to go surfing. Come on, Brian. Let's go surfing now.
Everybody's learning how. Come on a safari with us. Come on.
Let's go. Okay, Mr. Wilson, here's your wave. Go. Put ahead.
I'm driving up and down the demo street. I got